Today's the day we celebrate Transfiguration. The word transfiguration means a complete change of form or appearance into a more beautiful or spiritual state. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't usually use the word transfiguration except on this Sunday. It's not a word I use often. And yet, why do we celebrate every single year? The Sunday before Ash Wednesday, we celebrate Transfiguration. We hear this text, and we hear sermons about Transfiguration. Retired pastors say to me, "Oh, what are you going to do this year? You get the same text, the same theme, again and again. What are you going to say?" We know there's things about Transfiguration that seem clear, that we've heard sermons about, that we know to be the truth about this text. It seems to be a lot of symbolism, that we are reminded that Jesus is God's Son. It's very clear up on that mountain. It's very clear that Jesus trumps the law of Moses, the prophet Elijah. It seems that there's a foreshadowing of his resurrection. There's a lot going on there theologically, and I think all those things are great and true. And yet in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all include this story, and all of them use the Transfiguration story up on the mountain, but all of them also include what was going on down below. But this boy has epilepsy, and the father just wants help for his son. This is a person seeking help, wanting help for his child. And it seems that while Jesus is glorified, these disciples can do nothing to help him. Now, why is it that on this weekend that we celebrate Transfiguration, we have mostly highlighted Jesus? Jesus' great glory, the shining light, that Jesus is so awesome, and I wouldn't disagree with any of that. But very seldom do we mention the boy, or if we do, it's kind of in passing. What if this Transfiguration story is about Jesus, because Jesus is always the subject of every sentence. But what if the disciples and the boy and the father and the crowd are the ones that are transfigured? They are changed. They see God in flesh, living and being among them. And as awesome as it had to be up in that mountain, and terrifying, Jesus comes off and enters into the dirt and grime and everyday suffering of humans and makes a difference. Because what would that enlightenment mean for Jesus? Jesus is already being a minister amongst the people. This is chapter 9 in Luke, and I wonder if those disciples, we can find stories where they still don't get it. Or it seems as if they wonder, is this really the one? We've been following him, we've seen these incredible things, but what if he isn't God? What if they were transfigured that day to see God for who he, or Jesus for who he is as God's Son? And then for this boy and this father to realize that their suffering is not punishment from God, but that God enters into their human condition, that we are transfigured. My life was forever transfigured in July of 1990. I was spending time this summer in Hong Kong as a camp counselor for English gospel camps. We went there to have conversational English with fellow Christians at Bible camp. But most of it was just to have conversational English, because at that point Hong Kong was still a part of England, and to pass on to the next level in their academic system, they had to pass English. But they rarely had an opportunity to share English conversationally. So we spent time with many great people who are still my friends today. Thank you for Facebook, we stay in touch. And they have impacted my life deeply. But in July of 1990, I was transfigured. I was forever changed. We walked into Whitehead Detention Center on Hong Kong mainland. So many Vietnamese refugees were fleeing Vietnam in the 70s and hundreds of thousands in the decade of the 80s. In 1989, over 60,000 Vietnamese were living in Hong Kong, and the government did not know what to do with all this influx, so they built detention centers over the decade of the 80s. There was 55,000 housed in these detention centers. What happens to the Vietnamese when they were fleeing was they took an 80% chance of getting caught in a typhoon, because the best months to leave, because of the ocean currents, were June, July, and August, which is also peak typhoon season. They risked a 70% chance of being attacked by pirates, and many of them lost the little bit they had. They came to Hong Kong penniless. The Hong Kong government had the challenge of what do we do with all these people in this small space that already had 7 million people living there. So they built these detention centers. We were able to go in to Whitehead, which housed 25,000 of the refugees. And what they started to do in 1989 was they were trying to get people either sent back to Vietnam or decide if they were refugees. At that point, 20% had been deemed valid refugees, 20% had been deemed invalid, and the 60% were waiting. There were children who had been born in those camps, and they were living there for 8, 10, and 12 years. They were waiting. And in December of '89, they repatriated back 53 people, and there was an international outcry. Our missionary, John, had ways of getting things done like I've never seen. Somehow he convinced the director of the detention center to let us come in there. The only people who had been there before were senators and ambassadors, and he said we were the U.S. volleyball team. There were 10 of us, 3 guys, 7 women, and only 2 of us had ever played volleyball in our life. We were, for whatever reason, were able to go in. We got to tour the compound, many, many Quonset buildings, filled with 4 by 7 foot pallets, pieces of plywood. That was home for each family. Whether they had 2 people or 10 people, they were assigned a 4 by 7 foot piece of plywood. And in some of the Quonsets, we were able to look in the doors. They were anywhere from 3 to 6 high. That was their home. The food was very minimal. The medical conditions were atrocious. I know because I went for a loose ball, forgetting I was on pavement and not on a gym floor with knee pads, skinned up both my knees, and was taken to the medical facility. That was horrible. There were gangs that ran the camp at night, and the guards looked the other way. So we go in, and the director says, there are no pictures allowed. If I catch you taking pictures, I will need to keep your camera, my friend. Well, 3 of us, being young and naively fearless, decided to try to take pictures. The other 2 would shuffle their feet or cough, and the other one would snap the picture. This is long before digital. And we got out with 100 pictures of the conditions in those camps. In the afternoon, they allowed us to take 50 of the kids outside this prison wall with 2 armed guards and just play games with them. We had 1 tote with balloons. We had a lot of balloon fights. We played games that you could play with very few people. And what was fascinating is none of these kids had ever touched grass or felt the bark of a tree until that day. There were 10-year-olds who had never been outside that camp. They were born there and they lived there. I was transfigured that day. I could never see the world the same. I knew about refugees. I grew up Lutheran. We all know about Lutheran refugee resettlement programs. I had read all the concentration books you could. I visited Dachau just a few years before. I'd read books on slavery and slave ships. I'd read books on Japanese internment camps. But I'd never actually seen people caged like animals. I was transfigured. I could never be the same person I was that day when I was 23 years old. My idea of hospitality, my idea of what we do for refugees, my idea of materialism changed forever. I can't go back and be the girl I was on June 1990. They are transfigured and changed. That's what faith, I believe, is to be changed and to see God where we'd never seen God before. Because prior to that day, there were refugees throughout history. And we all know there's millions of refugees yet. The refugee status hadn't changed, but my ability to see was completely transformed and changed that day. What if Jesus' transfiguration was not so much about being the center of attention, but as saying, this is what God looks like in the flesh. And you don't always see it, but the layers come off. And sometimes it might be in the face or voice of a 2-year-old. Sometimes it might be in a hospice patient. Sometimes it might be in that crabby waitstaff. And we find Christ in the world. And we come down off those great moments because I am all about meditation and mindfulness and prayer. But it's not for me. It is to be out in the world. Because if all that happened that day in that detention center was I figured out what a lowly scum I am, or I figured out that I'm going to live as a guilt-ridden person the rest of my life, then the center of the subject and the topic is me. Instead, we are given the gift to go out into the world and to share that good news. This Wednesday, we begin Lenten season with our Ash Wednesday service. Most of you know I struggle with Lent, and it's not because of the darkness and the gloom. I, in fact, am really good at darkness and gloom. But man, I think I struggle with it because we've made it into almost one more thing for me. What am I going to give up for Lent? And then you hear people say, well, I gave up chocolate. Boy, am I suffering. I have headaches because I gave up Diet Coke. And it becomes about me. And it becomes narcissism incorporated. And that's the opposite of faith. I don't know if you've heard what Pope Francis has said about giving up things for Lent. He says we should reconsider this activity. And he quotes the Christian mystic John Chrysostom. And he says, no act of virtue can be great if not followed by advantage for others. So no matter how much time you spend fasting, no matter how much you sleep on a hard floor and eat ashes and sigh continually, if you do no good to others, you do nothing great. Then he goes on, in his own words, St. Pope Francis, I distrust a charity that costs nothing and does not hurt. He suggests that even more than candy or alcohol, we fast from indifference towards others. He calls this phenomenon the globalization of indifference. And then he writes, whenever our interior life becomes caught up in its own interests and concerns, there's no longer room for others, no place for the poor. God's voice is no longer heard. The quiet joy of his love is no longer felt, and the desire to do good fades. We end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain, and feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. This transfiguration, this change, Paul calls new birth. And we all know that change and giving birth are difficult and painful. And what we find in those situations is we can draw nearer to God and nearer to each other. And we are changed. We are transformed. And then we can echo those words of Peter up on the mountain who says, Lord, it is good to be here. It is good to be in a place where I can draw nearer to God and nearer to my neighbor. Not as narcissism, but as community and watching the kingdom of God being lived out each and every day. It's good, Lord, to be here. Amen. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the many ways that you help us to see, the ways that we are changed, even if we come kicking and screaming. We give you thanks for the ways that you gently nudge us. In those times it feels like we've literally been shoved into a change that we were not prepared for. And yet in those places we experience your presence and we experience the gift of community. And it is so good to be here, Lord. Amen.